Hi everyone, I'm Gertie and welcome to our pattern for October. This is called the Drama Club Cape. Now you all have been asking for a full-length vintage-inspired cape for quite some time now, and I'm very pleased to bring you this one. Now of course, being October and the way we love Halloween here at Charm, we did have to give you some costume examples in the samples this month. We've given you one sweet example and one very spooky one. But as always, I want to bring you a pattern that you can make year-round. And what I love about this cape is that you can make it a cozy garment for fall or winter. Just choose a wool or a coating, something that's going to keep you warm. Or if you're somewhere where you're headed into spring, this cape also looks fabulous in a cotton twill or a lightweight linens for just a light layering piece. Now, a little bit about this design. I was inspired by a 1930s cape for this, and it has a really interesting structure. It has a raglan shoulder, and it has a nice dramatic 30s style collar. And then it has a front panel which is shorter than the rest of the cape. It has darts, and just the front panel is held close to your body with a belt that goes inside the cape. The rest of the cape hangs free very dramatically, and it's longer in the back. And of course, you have to use a fabulous lining because when you raise your arm, you'll see a little flash of lining. And what else can I tell you? It has patch pockets and bound buttonholes. So we're going to be showing you bound buttonholes today, but also talking about other ways that you could close this cape if you're not into doing the bound buttonholes. So as always, the first thing we're going to be talking about is the pattern pieces, and then we will move on to fabric and supplies. Okay, so now we're ready to look at the pattern pieces. So as always, we have scaled these down to 25% so that you can see them all together on the table. I just feel like that helps you get a sense of how the pattern is going to come together when you sew it. So these four pieces here in the middle, these are sort of the main cape pieces. So let's look at those first. This one right here is the cape front panel, and that's the one I mentioned is shorter than the rest of the cape. It's the front, it's held close to the body with the belt. Now you'll see it does have a dart, and there are two groupings of cup sizes for this pattern piece, so make sure you cut the correct one. You'll also see that you have your bound buttonhole markings here, your patch pocket placement, and then you also have markings for your belt loops as well. So make sure you transfer those. You're going to cut two fabric on this piece. This is your cape side front. It gets sewn to the cape front panel, and you have circles on pretty much all of these pieces to help you match. So make sure that you're transferring all of these circles to your fabric. Cape side front, you're going to cut two fabric and you're going to cut two lining on this one as well. Okay, and that gets seamed to the cape front. Next, we'll go to our cape side back. And one thing I want to show you is that it's going to get sewn to the cape side front like this. And you can see this is the raglan shoulder shaping that gets formed here. It's almost like a dart. Some raglan sleeves have a dart at the top of the shoulder. Ours is formed through the shape of the seam right here. Okay, so that'll help it sort of cling to your shoulder in a way that keeps the cape where it's supposed to be. All right, so cape side back, cut two fabric, two lining. Here you have your cape center back, and you can see this one is cut on the fold. All right, so you're going to cut one fabric, one lining on the fold. All right, now let's look at the other pieces that are kind of around the edges here. This is your front facing for the cape. For this one, you're going to need to cut two fabric and two interfacing. Now this is your cape side front lining. For this, you'll be cutting two lining. This piece is your collar. So you're going to cut four fabric and two interfacing. And let's look at these tiny pieces over here. This long skinny one, this is your belt loop. You're just going to cut one of this, you sew it, and then you cut it into two belt loops. This piece right here is the bound buttonhole patch. So this one you're going to need to cut from your fabric as well as from interfacing. and 1 organza. So just to let you know the way that this works, you're going to cut the interfacing. The interfacing rectangle gets fused to the back of this piece, to the fabric, to stabilize it. And then the fabric piece is what becomes the bound buttonhole patches, okay? So you apply it as one and then you cut it into 3 separate patches. We're gonna show you the whole process, so don't worry too much about it now. And then the organza is what's used to finish the windows in the facing, okay? So just to repeat, that's your bound buttonhole patch, and you need 1 fabric, 1 interfacing, 1 silk organza. Okay, these are your patch pockets. You're gonna cut 2 fabric. Now, as with a lot of our pocket pattern pieces, we like to make sure that you can fit your phone into them, because personally, I need to have something to put my phone in so I can carry it around with me. And this one, you'll see, if you line up the circles from the pattern piece of the pocket to the cape front, it looks like they're not gonna match. And that's because when you make them match, it's going to form a little bit of ease so that it stands up slightly away from the coat front, from the cape front, and that's what allows you to put your phone in there and actually put something inside it, or your hands to keep them warm. All right, so there's your patch pocket. And then finally, we have our belt. So you're gonna cut 2 of this, 2 fabric. And then one thing I wanted to note is that you'll see that the grain line on this piece, we did put it this way so that you would be able to match any plaids or stripes the same way that you match them on the cape front. But this piece is very wide and it may not fit across your fabric, okay? So it is perfectly fine if you want to flip it this way and cut it parallel to the selvage of your fabric instead, okay? So you can also draw a new grain line at a 90-degree angle to this, okay? So just another option for your belt. All right, so those are all your pattern pieces. That's not too bad. I know it looks complicated, but you will start to get the hang of it once it comes together. All right, so next let's talk about fabric and supplies. All right, so we are ready to talk fabric and supplies. So as I mentioned in the intro, there are a lot of different directions and weights you could go with for fabric for this cape. So I'm going to show you some of my favorites, but as always, we give you more comprehensive recommendations in the instructions. So make sure to check those out. So here we're going to be going from sort of heavier weight and wools down to lighter weight options. So a couple fall winter options that I really like. You could do a tweed. This is a beautiful Harris tweed, one of my favorite fabrics we've ever used here. We made a Wanda skirt from this. So it would be nice to make a matching drama club cape for your Wanda skirt. This would be beautiful. So this is sort of like a medium weight wool, a little bit on the heavier side. Now, if you want something that is very, very cozy and warm, you'll want to look for something like a wool coating, okay? And that's what this is. It has a nice drape to it. That's one of the things I like about this particular wool. We used this in red for the swing coat several years ago, and it really has a beautiful sort of sheen to it and look. It has some alpaca and cashmere blended into it as well, so it has a nap to it. It's really pretty. So something like that would be great, or a synthetic blend coating, something like that could be nice and really warm. If you're interested in sewing with wool, but you want something a little more lightweight, a single wool crepe is really beautiful for this because it has such a lovely drape. And a big part of this design is the way it drapes in the back. So something like a crepe fabric is really going to highlight that dramatic drape. So a single wool crepe would be perfect, even a double wool crepe if you want something a little bit thicker. Now, let's say that you're looking for something that's more of a spring, warmer weather cape. This cape actually looks really beautiful in like a crisp cotton twill as well. So that's what this is, in a nice rose color. So something like this would be perfect for this as well. Make sure you use a lighter weight lining, something that breathes a little bit so you don't sort of accidentally counteract your nice breathable outer fabric. And then this would be a lovely choice too. This is the linen that we use for the carousel dress. And I love this polka dot and this color combo. But linen is a great choice for this cape. It would look great with a matching sheath dress underneath as well. Okay, so those are some fabric options depending on the climate you're sewing for. And then let's talk about lining. As I said earlier, this is a really wonderful opportunity to show off a flashy lining or a pop of color with your lining. Because of the openings where your arms come out, right, you're gonna see a little bit of your lining, or if you do a dramatic swish or something, you will see your lining. So let's talk options here. I would not go with a lining fabric that has any sheerness to it, you know, like a Bemberg or something. Wouldn't be great for this because you're gonna see through to the inside of the cape. You might see the seam allowances. So I think it's better to go with something that has more opacity to it. I have really been favoring synthetic satins for this cape because it's economical, also comes in beautiful colors, and I love like a shiny lining, something with a lot of sheen to it. So this is a synthetic satin. This is a great choice. I would love to see red in your lining. That would be beautiful. This is a silk crepe back satin. So you also get this in polyester if you don't want to spring for silk for your lining, which is totally understandable. As you can see, this has a little bit more drape to it. And then finally, if you're looking for something a little lighter weight, something like charmeuse or silk crepe would be nice for your lining as well. Okay, so those are just a few options, but again, really any lining fabric will work well. Finally, your utility fabrics, you're going to need a little bit of silk organza for finishing off your bound buttonhole windows, if you choose to do bound buttonholes. You will need some fusible interfacing for your cape as well. So those key pieces that need structure, like your collar, your front facing, your belt, which I did not mention in the last chapter, which is pointed out to me. You do need to cut 2 of your belt and 1 interfacing for that to give it a little structure. So some nice fusible interfacing types, you could do just a standard woven, or weft fusible is really nice for wool, so you might want to look into that, or tricot if you're doing a lighter weight outer fabric. And then a few more notions you might want to look into. Shoulder pads, if you're looking for a little more structure in your shoulder, you can add shoulder pads between the lining and the outer garment, but that's certainly not necessary. And then if you are not doing bound buttonholes, you'll want to have some way to close your cape. So you could do snaps, right? So these nice big snaps would be a good option. If you are doing buttonholes, then you will need buttons, of course. We recommend 1-inch buttons for this cape. And you will need a needle to match the weight of your fabric. Now, we've recommended a wide variety of weights of fabric here, so make sure you match the needle size to the weight of your fabric. These are 90-14, which is more suitable for a heavier weight fabric. So if you're doing a coating or a heavier weight wool, that would be a good size. And then last but not least, of course, you need thread, all-purpose polyester thread to match your fabric, both the outer coat and your lining. Okay, so that is it for fabric and supplies. Next, we're going to be talking a little bit about some tips for sewing wool. All right, so let's talk a little bit about sewing with wool. Wool is one of my favorite fabrics to sew with, and it's very satisfying to sew with, and it's also very beginner friendly. So if you're on the newish side to sewing, I would definitely recommend trying wool. Especially anything with a texture, like something that has a little bit of like a tweed texture or crepe. It really, your stitches just melt into it. It's very easy to press. It responds really well to steam and heat, and it really sews beautifully without a ton of effort on your part. So I definitely recommend giving it a try. So just a few of my favorite tips are, you do want to consider pre-shrinking your wool. Like I said, it does respond really well to steam. It may shrink when you steam it, okay? So if you're concerned about that, there are a couple ways that you can pre-shrink your wool yardage. The first is to steam the whole thing. So just put on a good TV show, set up your iron in front of the TV, and then you're just gonna spend a lot of time with a good steam iron, and you don't want to press it. You just wanna hover the steam over the yardage, do the entire section, and then move on. So that's one way to do it. The other way is you can do it in a dryer. You want to take a damp towel and put it in with your yardage and then put it on high heat to dry. So that it can be a little risky. I did it once in a communal dryer, and I didn't realize that dryers can build up a lot of residue from dryer sheets, so that can transfer to your fabric, and I found that out the hard way. So be careful there. And actually, I've switched to using wool balls instead of dryer sheets, which actually is a good thing to do in general for your fabric health. So I'd recommend that instead of dryer sheets, because that does have that residue on it. So keep that in mind. Now, some more steaming pressing tips. Wool does respond really well to pressing as you're sewing, but you can also get shiny spots from high heat onto your wool. So you're going to want to test a little bit to see how your particular fabric responds to heat. And I would be really careful while you're pressing about directly pressing on the fabric. So one thing you can do is, we recommend these silk organza pressing cloths here at Charm because you can see through them as you're working. They withstand high heat and it will protect your fabric from shiny spots. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. The other thing to be aware of with wool is that the heavier ones can get very bulky when you're sewing them. So there are a few things to keep in mind. When you have a couple layers of heavyweight wool going under your presser foot, it can be quite tricky to feed it through your machine. So you will want to see if your machine has adjustable presser foot pressure, and you can lower the pressure to make it easier to feed bulky fabrics through. We're also going to be showing you some techniques for that as we get into the sewing of this. Another thing to mention is that it can be very difficult to sew buttonholes by machine onto thick wools. So you may want to do a test buttonhole before you commit to something like machine buttonholes. And that's another reason that I love bound buttonholes, is because the bulk usually is not an issue when sewing bound buttonholes. If you're intimidated by all of the buttonhole talk, you can also just do snaps, and that will look great on this cape. A few other tips about bulk. You will want to grade your seam allowances, okay? So we'll be taking you through that process where it is applicable on the cape today. So make sure that you follow those steps for grading your seam allowances. And then finally, if you have a real sturdy, bulky wool, you may find that it's hard to press the seam allowances open because they tend to want to close back up. So there's a tool called a clapper. It's really just like a wooden block. Sometimes it has a point presser attached to it, but it's a great tool for flattening bulky seams. So the way you would do that is you would steam your seam allowance open, and then you use the clapper to genuinely clap or beat your fabric into submission and flatten it once it's been steamed. So that's a tool that you can try out for those bulky wools. All right, so those are just a few of my favorite tips, but as always, we've given you even more tips in the instructions, so please do make sure to check that section on sewing with wool out. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is sew our bound buttonholes. Now, bound buttonholes are unusual because they come at the very beginning of the process, where if you're making machine buttonholes, they will come at the very end, or if you're sewing on snaps, that will also be at the very end. Now, as you may know, I love bound buttonholes. I've talked about them a lot over the years, and we do have a really thorough section on sewing bound buttonholes in the Lillian jacket video, which is free on YouTube, and that is a beautiful fit and flare jacket that is included with my new book, Goooodbyyye's Charmed Sewing Studio. So definitely check that out if you want even more about bound buttonholes. And also if you want more tailoring tips and tricks. So if you get you get the tailoring bug from sewing this drama club cape, that is a great way to have an entree into jacket tailoring as well. Now, one very important thing that I want you to remember, because I feel like I keep forgetting this, is that, you cut one interfacing and one fabric for your patch as well as one organza. That fusible interfacing does not get fused to the fabric patch, okay? It gets fused to the wrong side of your cape front to stabilize where you're going to be cutting the bound buttonholes. So you're probably going to be tempted, because you cut them out, you know, like you do a collar, you cut out one fabric, one interfacing, and then you fuse them together. It's not that way with the patch, okay? So just remember that. And I do know that bound buttonholes can be a little bit scary. They're a bit of a more advanced vintage inspired technique. So if you're not feeling like you want to do it on this project, that is totally fine. You will want to test machine buttonholes on a couple layers of your fabric because machine buttonholes on home sewing machines can be tricky sometimes, especially with very thick fabric. All right. And then of course, the easiest option would be to hand sew on snaps, which would happen at the end of the process as well. And if you do that, you can always put decorative buttons on, just sewn on the right side of the garment as well, so that you have the look of buttons. All right, so those are a few options, but I do hope you'll give bound buttonholes a try. So we'll get started with those next. Okay, so we're gonna get right into our bound buttonholes. You can see that we've already done stay stitching on the cape neckline. And now you can also see that the bound buttonholes are marked in several places on the wrong side of the cape front, then on the wrong side of the interfaced front facing, as well as you have your patch of interfacing, which we have not fused to anything yet, but we have marked in the bound buttonhole markings on the non-glue side of the interfacing patch. So like I said a little bit earlier, it's very tempting to apply that fusible to the patch itself, but we're gonna apply this right to the jacket front. And we're gonna match up those bound buttonhole markings from the interfacing patch to the jacket front. And another way to do this is you can just kind of, before marking anything, you can apply the interfacing patch in the general area of the buttonholes on the jacket front or the cape front, and then use your pattern to transfer the markings to the interfacing wrong or right side. I'm confusing myself here. So that way you would only have to do it once. But the important thing is that we now have the interfacing fused to the wrong side of the cape front and the bound buttonholes are marked on the interfacing. And now we're gonna take our patch, and you don't need to mark the bound buttonholes on the patch, though I think Andrea ends up marking them just to be super extra precise, which I appreciate always. You can see she went ahead and marked them there, and that is gonna help her align the buttonholes exactly to the markings on the cape front. But because we're gonna be stitching from the wrong side of the cape front, we're gonna be following the markings there. So you can see she's aligning it perfectly, marking to marking by using a pin from one side to the other and making sure that all the marks are aligned. And we like to use these longer patches here at Charm just because then you can sew them all at once and cut them into 3 smaller patches. I just feel like it's a little less awkward that way than having 3 tiny patches that you're aligning. And now we are placing pins around the buttonholes and this is just to secure the patch in place. And next thing we're gonna do is stitch around the bound buttonhole markings. So this step, if you don't like having a lot of pins as you're stitching around the bound buttonholes, you can also hand baste the patch in place around the outer edges, just using some nice big stitches. Okay, and now you're going to be using a short stitch length, so 1.5 millimeters is good. And you want to start in the middle of one long edge of a buttonhole. And you don't need to backstitch. And you're stitching exactly on that line. And then when you get to the corner, you want to use your hand wheel here so you don't overshoot. You're going to pivot, and now we're going to stitch along the short end. And you want to count your stitches here. So Andrea just did 6 stitches along that short end. So you're going to remember that number so that you do the same amount on the other short end, which is what keeps those buttonholes looking symmetrical from one side to the other. Okay, and again, pivoting exactly using your hand wheel. And when you're doing the short ends, you're probably going to want to use your hand wheel for those last couple stitches as well, because it's easy with the foot pedal to accidentally stitch too far. And now when you get back to your first side, again, you're not going to backstitch, you're just going to overlap the stitching. Backstitching creates too much thread bulk on these bound buttonholes, so you just want to overlap, and that will help secure your stitches. As well as having the short stitch length helps too. Okay, so we're going to continue that on the other 2 buttonholes, and then we will move on to the next steps. All right, so now that we have stitched the patch on, right sides together, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to cut open the bound buttonholes. And I know this part is really scary because you are cutting into your cape front, but you've got this. Make sure you use sharp scissors. And if you're feeling nervous, use smaller scissors too. But the important thing is that they're sharp, so you're not hacking away at your fabric. So you're cutting down that center line of the buttonhole marking. And you're only going to about 1/4 inch away from the short end. And then when you get to 1/4 inch away from the short end, you're cutting diagonally into each corner of the short end. And you're cutting as close as you can to the stitching without cutting through it. So you're creating a little Y shape on each side of the buttonhole. So that will create these little triangles on each end. Okay, so you're going to repeat that with the other 2 buttonholes. And I know this part feels really weird if you've never done bound buttonholes before, but just take your time, be very careful with your cutting here. And now you can see we are going to cut this long patch into 3 smaller patches. So you're going to cut in between each of the buttonholes to create 3 uniform little patches. And then you're going to flip the patch through to the wrong side. And you're just going to use your fingers here to manipulate it so that you're creating a nice, clean-looking rectangle. And you can kind of pull out the short ends. If you're seeing too much puckering in the corners, that probably means you didn't clip quite close enough to the corners. So you might want to go back and fix that. But if you're seeing a nice, clean rectangle like we have here, then you're good. Okay, so we're going to do that on all 3. And then the next step is to form what's called the lips of the bound buttonhole. There's been a lot of debate in the studio. A lot of people find that term creepy, but it's like a little mouth, right? So you're forming a little mouth here, and these are the lips. You're using your fingers to manipulate and then finger press each side of the patch up to the center of the opening. And what you're looking for is 2 uniform little lips from the right side of the bound buttonhole. And this is like a welt pocket. Maybe you've done a welt pocket before, but kind of like on our Rizzo jacket, I think we did a welt pocket on the Rizzo jacket. Yes, we did. Okay. I couldn't remember for a second. We did. And the dandy vest. So this is just like a tiny little welt pocket with a welt on both sides. Maybe we just call them welts, and that will maybe lay this controversy to rest. Okay, so you're just going to form those little welts on both sides of the mouth and pin it in place in each corner. Andrea's using cotton canvas here, which is a tough fabric to make bound buttonholes in, I gotta say. So if it's your first time doing bound buttonholes, which obviously it's not Andrea's, I would really recommend using a wool, like a thinner wool potentially, like a crepe or something like that, or a wool flannel. It just makes beautiful bound buttonholes. Okay, so this is an optional step, but one that's really good to do if you're worried about the bound buttonhole welts slipping around at all in the next couple steps. So what we're doing here is just hand basting the lips closed, just using a whip stitch. So yeah, nothing really more to say about that than just using little stitches. These are temporary stitches that you would take out later, and they're just holding those lips in place for the next steps. Okay, so now what we're doing is we are stitching in the ditch created by those little welts. So you're gonna use a short stitch length again. I think 1.5 millimeters is good, just like you use when sewing on the patch. And you're going to, again, just like sewing around those rectangles, start in the middle of one long end, go to a short end. You can count your stitches here if you want, but I feel like it's more important to be precise and not have any stitching showing. So you want to be careful to be working within the ditch, right? So the ditch being the sort of like gutter created between the welt and the jacket front, coat front, cape front. Sorry, what are we sewing? Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. So now you can see she's continuing along the long end, the other long end, and then doing the opposite short end. The method we're using, by the way, is one that I've been using for years. It's in my first book, Gertie's new book for better sewing. And not much has changed about it because this is my favorite method to do bound buttonholes. But one thing you may notice if you have that book is that in the book, I recommend doing this part by hand with a pick stitch because that gives you a little more control. So just know that that is an option. Okay, so now what we're doing is we are exposing the little triangles that were created when you made those little Y shapes cutting. So you're just folding back the cape front, and then we are going to stitch on the patch only to secure the triangle to the patch. And that's just going to hold those folds in place on the inside. And that's it. That's your bound buttonhole. So you've done one. You're going to repeat the stitch in the ditch on the other two before we move on to next steps. Okay, so now we're going to sew our pockets, and you're going to take your pocket and your fabric and your lining and put them right sides together. And for the first steps, we're just going to be sewing this upper edge that Andrea is pinning now. So just pin them together along the upper edge, and then we're going to stitch at 5/8 of an inch. Make sure you switch back to your regular 2.5 millimeter stitch length. And also you can see that Andrea finished the edges of the pocket on the serger, which is not necessary. So don't worry about doing that because these are going to be fully enclosed. And that pretty much goes for the entire cape. The lining does hang free. If your fabric is extra ravelly, you definitely can finish those edges just to be on the safe side. Okay, so now we're grading that seam allowance. So the lining is the shorter one, and then the pocket is the wider seam allowance. And now we're going to understitch the lining. So from the right side, just holding the two layers away from each other nice and taut, using your fingers to hold them flat. You're stitching about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line and making sure that your seam allowances are oriented underneath where you're stitching. And now you kind of fold in, rolling out the seam line to the edge and press from the wrong side. All right, now we're going to go and we're going to sew the remaining sides of the pocket. So you're going to turn it back right sides together and fold that upper understitching to one side. And then pin around the edges. And now what you need to know is that we're going to leave about a 2-inch opening at the bottom of the pocket so that we can turn it right side out. Okay, so when you get to the bottom, you're just gonna kind of center a 2-inch area there. You can eyeball it. And what Andrea's doing is she's putting 2 X'd pins on either side of that so that she doesn't forget about the opening. It's very easy to just keep sewing around the entire pocket once you're on a roll, right? So doing those pins in an X shape will help remind you. All right, so now we're gonna start on one upper edge, and you're gonna stitch all the way around, making sure to backstitch and break your stitching on either side of the opening. She's playing real fast and loose with sewing over those pins there, but I don't think she actually hit any. I have seen your comments on the YouTube videos saying you're very proud of Andrea for not sewing over pins lately, so thank you for that. She has been way better. All right, so now we're going to trim down these seam allowances. And you can leave the seam allowances the full width in your opening because that will help you turn them in once we have everything folded right sides out. And final thing you'll want to do, some notches around the curvy lower edges. That will help this lay flat when you're pressing it without any wrinkles or buckles around the curves. And then you're going to trim diagonally across the upper edges here, the upper corners, just to get rid of any bulk there. All right, now we're going to turn right side out. And you can kind of poke those corners out and wiggle them out with your fingers, or use, a point presser or something like that to help turn them out for a nice crisp corner there. And now you're going to press around the edges and turn in the seam allowances on the opening. And just press the whole thing flat. And there is your finished pocket ready to stitch onto your cape front. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to be sewing our patch pockets. And you're going to be seeing a little special tip for sewing bulky fabrics or sewing a bulky patch pocket onto your cape front. So you'll see in the video that we're going to be showing you how to use a remnant or a little scrap of fabric in a technique called a hump jumper, and it helps you sort of transition onto a bulky area of your project more seamlessly. Okay, so you're going to see that in the next chapter, and then you will have your beautiful patch pocket sewn. All right, so we're going to look at a method for working with bulky fabrics here. So we've created a sample in this herringbone wool, which is quite thick. You may remember we made a Maria dress out of this that was featured in a magazine a few seasons ago. I love this fabric, and it does get pretty thick, so when you have a folded section with seam allowances like this pocket, it gets quite bulky, right? So when you're sewing from just one layer onto the pocket. So what we're gonna do is use this method. We're gonna use a scrap of fabric folded until it's the thickness of the pocket itself. And you're gonna put it right next to the pocket where you're gonna start stitching. And this is gonna create a level surface. So what can happen is your machine will get stuck or stalled when half the presser foot is, sort of slanted down and not level. So this is gonna create a level surface here. So you're gonna put the scrap of fabric behind the pocket, allowing it to level out here. And you're going to start stitching, we're edge stitching the pocket, and you don't want to stitch it all onto the scrap. It's just a tool to get started your stitching. just leveling out the back half of the presser foot. And that's really all there is to it. It's a nice little trick for when you're sewing thick fabrics, denim, wool, anything that gets really thick when you have several layers. Okay, so now we're edge stitching around the pocket, being real careful around those curves here. And you can do a little bar tack on each upper corner if you like, if you're concerned about the fabric getting a lot of wear and tear here. I know I can be pretty hard on my pockets, what with putting my phone in and out and dog treats and all of that. So if you're concerned about that, then you can do a little bar stitch, which is just very tight zigzag stitching on the upper corners to secure it. But with something like a cape, it may not be an everyday wear item, so you may not be as concerned, in which case, totally valid choice to skip the bar tacking here and just backstitch a few times. Okay, so now we're using that scrap of fabric again at the other corner just to level out the presser foot once again. And that's all there is to it. And so there's our sample in that bulkier fabric. But you can use this on any fabric really if you're finding your machine is just having trouble getting started in a corner of a pocket or something similar. So now we're going to repeat those steps on the jacket or the cape front. On the cape front, we're going to do the same thing in our fabric. And as we talked about in the pattern pieces section, there is a little bit of ease built into the top of this pocket, which I do in a lot of my designs just because it's a very vintage look and it also is more practical because it gives you room in your pocket, right? So make sure that you're matching the corners of the pocket to the pocket circles and pinning the rest of the pocket in place. And you should just see a little bit of dimension at the top of the pocket. So just pinning in place all the way around the pocket, and then we are going to edge stitch. And if you like, you can use contrast thread here for a bit of a sportier look. But if you're going for something more elegant, glam, then you're probably going to want to match your thread color. All right, so now we're going to work on the belt loops that your tie will go through on the front panel. So you have your placement marked in on your cape front, and you want to finish, okay, so you've got this long skinny piece that is both belt loops, and you want to finish each long edge. You can serge or zigzag, whatever you want to do. And then you're going to turn each long edge in 1/4 inch and press. And then you're going to edge stitch both sides. And again, if you're doing edge stitching in a contrasting color, you're just going to want to keep it consistent throughout, of course. So if you did a contrast edge stitch on your pocket, use that same color for your belt loops. And backstitch on each end and repeat sewing that other long end. Just about 1/8 of an inch or 1/16 of an inch away from the edge, just to secure. You might be working with bulky fabrics, so just turning in the edges is a much easier way to sew these rather than trying to turn it right side out. Okay, so now you're going to fold it in half and cut. So now you have 2 belt loops rather than one long one. And now you're going to press in 5/8 of an inch on each short end. And press those in place. And now you are going to align with the placement marks on your cape front and pin in place. And then of course we're going to stitch these in place. You can just use a straight stitch and back stitch back and forth, Or if you're, again, concerned about wear and tear on this area, this is a place that you could use a zigzag with a really short stitch length and sort of do a bar tack over each end. And that will make sure that these ends are very secure. So that's something that you would see on like jeans construction or something like that, where you get a lot of wear and tear on those areas. But for this one, we're just going to backstitch on both ends and edge stitch across the folded short ends of the belt loop. This cape construction is so interesting, and it was taken directly from vintage cape patterns where only the front panel is belted to you. So the belt is going to get threaded underneath the back cape, which is loose, if that makes any sense. So these two belt loops will hold that in place, hold that front panel to you for a nice fitted look, and then the back is very loose and glamorous. And there you go. And once that's done, you can trim away the seam allowances underneath if you want. Okay, so now we're sewing the bust dart in the front panel. Initially, we weren't sure if we were going to have a bust dart in this design, but then it really helped the front panel fit the way it's supposed to, sort of holding it close to the body and contouring around the bust. So we do have two bust cup groupings on this one, so make sure, well, it's a little late at this point, but you want to make sure that you're using the right size bust cup, of course, when you cut it out. And you're going to just sew it like any other bust dart. So pinning those legs together, backstitching at the edge, and then leaving long tails at the point. And of course, just very gradually going off the fabric here. I like my last couple stitches on a dart to be just parallel to the fold so that you don't veer off very suddenly. And now you're going to tie those threads by hand. Grab your cat ham, and now we are going to press that dart down. And use the ham to really smooth the dart over the surface so you don't get any bubbles around the point. And you want to spend some time pressing that. And then we're ready to move on. All right, so now we are going to create the buttonhole windows on the front facing, which is where your button passes through the bound buttonhole, of course. So we're going to do this with an organza patch. And marking precisely is so important on this because if your facing doesn't align with your buttonholes on the outer jacket, then there's going to be some bubbling and such. So the other thing I'll say is that you can do this step later in the process after you've sewn the facing on. It's way more awkward, right? Because you have a whole cape at that point. But then you'll be able to ensure that everything is aligned perfectly after sewing. So that's the way that some people teach it. Just for ease of sewing, especially for beginners to this process, we teach the window method here. Okay, so what Andrea's doing is she stitched the organza patch to the front facing, right sides together, around the buttonhole windows, just like we did with the buttonhole patch in the first chapter. Okay, so counting your stitches on the short ends and then cutting open each little window and cutting wise into each short end. And then you're going to slash the organza patch into 3 separate patches between the buttonholes. And then you're going to turn the organza. This probably all feels very familiar because it's what we did with the patch, but then things get a little different here. Turn the organza to the wrong side of the facing And now we're just going to press this. It's just to create a rectangular window. We're not going to be forming lips like we did with the buttonhole patch itself. Okay, so you're just going to use your fingers to manipulate the organza, and it's creating a nice clean finish window that you're going to press from the wrong side. And you can see how Andrea is sort of stretching out the organza here to create a nice finish. So sort of pulling it to each side and then pressing. And spend some time with this. You can go back if you're not quite happy with it and keep pressing. But that's what you're going to do. You're going to create 3 little window openings like this, and then it will all get stitched together once the facing is applied to the cape itself. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we are going to sew this front facing to the front lining. So you can see we've already stitched and pressed the dart in the cape lining front, and stay stitched around that curvy area on the front facing. So this is a lot like sewing a princess seam, right? We're sewing 2 opposing curves to each other, and the one that's sort of an inner curve, you have stay stitched, and then you're clipping about every ½ inch. And now we're going to be putting them right sides together and spreading those clips to get the curves to match. So Andrea pinned first at the notch, and then she's pinning at the edges, and then distributing throughout, which is a great way to approach this. That straight section is very easy to pin. And now we are spreading those clips, and these curves are very different, okay? So you're gonna have, that means the more dramatic the curves are, the more spreading and pinning you're gonna have to do. So you can see she's spreading each of those clips and placing a pin on each one. And this may seem fussy, but doing this, trying to sew this seam without these steps is kind of a nightmare. So I always see people trying to skip this step in retreats and things like that when we're all sewing together. And this to me is one of the most simple things you can do to make sewing curves like this easy instead of totally impossible. So I really recommend it. And then just taking your time, spreading those clips, and then you shouldn't have any trouble sewing these 2 seams together, or these 2 curves together. You can see she's getting a little bit of sort of like buckling on the underside because of how extreme these pieces are, the shapes are. So you can just sort of flip to the wrong side and make sure the lining is nice and smooth. You know, your lining fabric is probably a lot thinner than your outer fabric, which is, it's going to slip around and try to create those little folds. So just take your time with it. So again, just being very careful that everything is laying flat on the lining side, especially because we're going to be stitching from the clip side. So you're going to need to make sure that everything's flat on that side because you're not going to be able to monitor it as closely as the upper side when you're stitching, of course. Okay, so starting at the bottom or one end, you're going to be stitching at 5/8 of an inch. The straight edge is very easy to sew, of course. And then when you get to the clips, you're really going to take your time, make sure everything's laying flat, remove your pins. And you can continue to spread the clips open as you go, just to help the 2 pieces match each other. So this is a section where you can really take your time, slow down, and just really take it one stitch at a time, removing your pins as you go. And you can see Andrea sort of using her thumbs underneath the layer to make sure that everything is nice and flat on the underside, where we were seeing the lining kind of trying to buckle there. And that's a nice little demonstration of what we're seeing here of that corner that doesn't match up at the very corner, but it does match up on the 5/8 of an inch seam line. Okay, so now she's checking her work and seeing if there's any little folds in there. And this is your chance to go back and fix it if there are. So you would just sort of remove the stitching in that one section if you needed to, if you have a mistake, and then go back and fix it. And now we're going to do, again, this might feel really familiar if you've sewn a lot of princess seams and used our method. You're going to do some notches on the curvy side, on the lining side. And grade your seam allowances. The lining is the wider seam allowance in this case. And then both seam allowances are going to get pressed towards the lining. So if you see any little puckers, you may need to go back and fix them, or you may be able to press them out with a little steam, depending on how bad they are. So pressing everything towards the lining side here, seam allowances and all. Okay, so that is it. Now we have our facing sewn to our front lining. Okay, so now we're going to sew the cape back unit, essentially. So what you're seeing in the middle here is the cape center back, and then on the right is one cape side back. So we're going to be sewing the seam, the side back being sewn to the cape center back on one side, right sides together. And this is just a long, easy seam to sew. It's also very big, so kind of hard to get a sense of what it is on camera. It reminds me of when we have to sew those big skirts on camera, and it's really hard to tell what we're doing sometimes. But it's just one long seam. It's almost like princess seams on the back of the cape, right? Sort of at those two style lines. So you're going to do this on both sides, sewing both side back capes to the center back cape, right sides together. And luckily this is a real easy seam to sew, no clipping or stay stitching or notching or anything needed. You're just going to pin together every few inches and then stitch at 5/8 of an inch. Backstitch on each ends, and then we're going to press this seam open. Okay, so there's one side done, and then you're going to repeat that for the other cape side back, and then we'll have a completed cape back unit. Okay, so the next thing that has happened off camera is that Andrea sewed the cape side front to the cape back unit. So that's that seam that goes over the shoulder and is kind of curved. Okay, so now the only thing left to do is that we are going to sew the cape fronts to the cape side fronts. Now, this is just a short little seam because if you look at the pictures of this cape from the photo shoot, there is an opening for your arm. And again, this is very much based on vintage capes. You would wear, beautiful gloves or a beautiful blouse underneath, and then you would be, have that freedom of movement from the opening. And also to show off your gloves and your jewels and whatever else, your fancy handbag. Okay, so you're sewing from the neckline down to the circle only because that's where the opening begins for your arm. Okay, so matching at the neckline and then putting an X pin at your circle so you remember to stop sewing. So again, just a regular seam here, 5/8 of an inch and 2.5 millimeters long. and then backstitching at that circle mark. Now you're going to need to clip to the circle because the seam allowances are going to be pressed open above the circle, and you don't have to worry about them below the circle for now. So press those open. And next we're going to move on to constructing the collar. Okay, so now we're going to be sewing the center back of the collar. So you're going to pin the interface collar together at one short end. And you'll want to have it interfaced, obviously, and marked in your roll line, which is that red marking you can see here. And this is an angled seam, so you're going to have to pivot slightly at the marked roll line. And we're going to press this open, but to do that, you're going to need to clip into the point where the roll line is, and then press open. So you want to press in two separate stages here, above the roll line and below the roll line. And that is your collar center back seam. Okay, so you have another collar set here, the uninterfaced side. That's going to be the underside of the collar. And the interface side will be the upper side as you're wearing the cape. And you're going to pin the two together. They're both stitched at the center back seam in the same way. So Andrea stitched the uninterfaced one off camera, just to be clear. And we're pinning them together around the two short edges and one long edge, the non-roll line side. And then we're going to stitch around those three sides, pivoting at the two corners. And again, this is just your regular 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and 2.5 millimeter stitch length. You're gonna make sure those seam allowances stay pressed open at center back. And now you can grade your seam allowances. The narrower seam allowance will be the uninterfaced side, and the wider one will be the interfaced one. And remember, the interfaced one is the upper collar as you're wearing it. And that's pretty much always on a blouse, a jacket, a coat, a cape. The interfaced side wants to go on top because you'll see that it'll support better and have better structure. You're going to turn it right side out here, and next we're going to understitch the collar. Okay, so now we're going to understitch the collar. But first you want to make sure that those points are poked out very crisply. I always think poke isn't quite the right word because you want to be gentle, of course, with this. And you can use the point presser, but then also use your fingers to sort of ease it out. But you don't want to break your stitching, of course. And now we are going to understitch the underside of the collar, of course, the uninterfaced side. And this is awkward, as you can see. So because we have those two corners and you're not going to be able to stitch into both of them, you're going to go as far as you can on one short end, break your stitching, trim your threads, and then continue as close as you can to the corner, but don't kill yourself trying to get in there along that long edge. And this is just like the understitching we did earlier, holding those two layers taut away from each other and making sure your seam allowances are underneath where you're stitching. And again, you're going to have to break your stitching around this corner here and continue along the short edge. And now that understitching is going to help us press this nice and flat. So using your fingertips to roll the understitching to the outside of the collar and press flat. And now we are going to pin along the open edge and baste these edges together. Okay, so just pin those edges together, and then we're going to use a long machine stitch to baste. So 4 or 5 millimeter stitch length, and then a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then you have a completed collar unit ready to be basted to your cape. Okay, so now we are ready to attach the collar to the cape itself. So you have a lot of match points here, of course, and before you pin anything, make sure that your interfaced collar is the upper layer here as you're pinning them together. And so you're going to match at the neckline edge, and then you'll want to match notches to seam. So you can see there's a notch that matches to that raglan seam there. So you're going to place a pin there. So the only tricky thing about sewing this seam is that one side is kind of curved and the other is, the collar is more straight, and that you have all these seam allowances here that are going to want to fold in on themselves and close. So you want to pin on both sides of the seam allowance to make sure they stay open. And then you'll need to use more pins throughout just to distribute that ease around the curved sections. And then once everything is nice and flat and pinned in place, you are going to stitch this, starting at one neckline edge and going to the other, stitching at 5/8 of an inch, and just taking it really slow and making sure that all of your seam allowances stay pressed open, and also that the raw edges of the fabric are staying flush with each other. That, you know, the more curved side isn't trying to sneak out from underneath or anything like that. So it also gets a little tight around the neckline curve. So you'll see here as we start coming up to all these seam allowances. So just take your time, and you can kind of like keep everything nice and flat with your fingers. If you see a fold start to form like Andrea just did, stop with your needle down, lift the presser foot, and just smooth everything out before continuing. It's really just all these seam allowances that make it a little bit tricky here. But other than that, fairly straightforward. You're just stitching a collar to a neckline. And the exciting thing is that once this collar is on, the cape is pretty much done, the outer cape. And then you'll just need to, of course, attach the lining unit. And then we have a belt to do, of course, as well. And then any finishing. So at this point, we're getting pretty close to having a finished cape. I'm excited to see it in this cotton canvas, a more spring-like fabric, because of course for the photo shoot we are really focused on Halloween looks and fall and a more cool weather garment. But I just love the idea of this for spring as a light layering piece in a pretty color like this petal pink cotton twill. And it doesn't necessarily have to be this heavy winter garment. Okay, so you're going to stitch all the way to the neckline, and don't worry about grading these seam allowances yet, because that's going to happen after we attach the lining and facing unit. So there's your completed outer cape. Okay, so now we are ready to attach the lining unit to the outer cape at the arm opening. So that's that sort of slit in the front where you put out your gloved hand very dramatically. Okay, so you want to make sure first that you hang the lining and the cape outer for 24 hours, and then you are going to measure up from the ground so that you are hemming them evenly, because they may have stretched on the bias, because there is some circular fullness to this cape. So then you are going to, after evening, you are going to hem your cape lining. And the cape lining is going to be 1/2 inch shorter than the outer cape. And now we are putting them together at the center front first, but then we're really going to be focusing on this arm opening. So there's that point, there's a circle where we clipped into our seam allowances, that raglan seam. So you're going to pin from there down. You see we are pinning the dart here, and then pinning down to the hem. And now we are going to be focusing on getting a clean finish at the hem. So that means your lining hem should be shorter than your cape. And then you're going to fold the hem, the pressed hem of the cape, so that it's enclosing the lining. So folding it towards the lining and then continuing to pin. So you're kind of nesting those seam allowances inside each other, or those hem allowances inside each other. And so then when we stitch, we'll get a nice clean corner there, okay? So continue to fill in pins. And this is the front cape panel side. And now we're going to go to the cape side of this arm opening, and do the same thing with the clean finish at the hem on that side, wrapping the the hem allowances around each other to get that clean finish corner there when we stitch it. And you can see it's a little complex there at the circle point of the raglan seam where all those seam allowances meet. So what we're going to do is we're going to stitch these two sides separately and break our stitching at that point so that you don't have to pivot at that point, because you want that to be nice and clean there. Okay, so once you have both sides of the arm opening pinned, then you're going to start on one side at the hem, stitching up towards the circle of the raglan seam, a 5/8 of an inch. And then you're going to back stitch at the circle, break your stitching, and then continue on the other side, moving all those seam allowances out of the way. And there are darts, just make sure that they stay pressed down towards the hem. And then you're going to back stitch at the hem here. Now you're going to grade your seam allowances. So the lining will be the narrower seam allowance. And the cape will be the wider one. So we're going to do that off camera. And then we're going to come back and you'll attach the 2 units at center front as well. Okay, so now we are going to be attaching the facing and lining unit to the cape at the center front and around the neck opening. So you've already attached it on the side, right? You can see next to the belt loop there, that side is already attached. And now we're going to be folding it back, right sides together, and pinning all along this edge and doing the same clean finish at the corners and stitching all the way around the neck hole as well. So before we got to this step, just important to note that the last thing you saw in the last chapter was grading the seam allowances on the arm opening. You're also going to understitch that arm opening, okay? So you're going to do all those steps, and now we're moving on to sewing the center front and the neck opening. So again, just making that clean finish at the lower edge here because we want to have nice clean corners at the hem, at the openings, and then filling in pins in between. And you just want to check that your bound buttonholes are aligning with your buttonhole openings. Hopefully they are. And then you're going to keep pinning all the way around. Now you can see we're moving on to the neck opening. So the collar is sandwiched in between the 2 layers, the outer cape and the lining unit here. And you're matching all of those seam lines. Any notches. We've got a curved neckline area here. This is going to get a little bit thick with the collar sandwiched in between, especially if you're using a heavy wool or something like that. So just match all your match points, fill in pins in between. This is going to take a little while. As you can see, this is a substantial seam that we're pinning here. But the great thing is, this is really one of the final steps. What we have to do after this is making our belt, of course, which is really just a rectangle. And then any finishing work like hand stitching on the inside, hand stitching those bound buttonhole windows on the inside, tacking the hem and the outer cape together if you like, finishing at the hem of the facing. Really not a lot. So if you're overwhelmed by this step, just know that we're so close. We're almost there. It's going to be so beautiful. Okay, so now you can see we are continuing down the opposite center front opening. And again, creating that final clean finish. And then pinning along this nice straight edge here. No buttonholes on this side. This is the side that the buttons are going to be sewn on. Okay, and now we have a nice long seam to sew after all that pinning. So you're going to start at one lower hem corner, stitch up to the neckline, and then there's going to be a circle where you're going to pivot here. This is where the collar starts, right? The collar is positioned right at that circle. And so now this should be pretty bulky, especially if you're using a thicker fabric. So take your time here. If you have adjustable presser foot pressure on your machine, these machines that we use in the studio don't have it, unfortunately, but yours might. And if you're finding it really thick to get your fabric through here, you can lower the pressure so that the foot isn't clamping quite so tight and you have more clearance underneath the foot for thicker fabrics. Okay, so now I'm sure you can imagine we have a lot of trimming and grading and understitching to do here. So you're going to want to clip across any corners. Any of those clean finish corners need to be clipped across at the pivot point, and then grade your seam allowances and understitch. Okay, so now we're going to pull the cape through so that it's right side out. So from the back, you're going to reach between the layers and reach to those center front panels and pull each one through the shoulder. It's kind of like when you're doing a sleeveless dress, same process, right? So reach through, you have to do both sides individually. Now the cape will be right side out. And now we still just have to understitch the center front edges. Okay, so here you might want to just check for any tucks, just look at your work around the outer edges that we just sewed. And then also you'll want to kind of poke out those clean finish corners. They'll all need to be turned right side out by hand. Got a nice little clean finish there. Yeah, and then just sort of use your fingers to turn them out or a point presser. And now we just want to understitch these center front edges. So it's all a little unwieldy at this point. It's quite big, this project, but we're going to open out the facing from the cape itself and then understitch the facing from the hem up to where it meets the collar at that pivot point circle there. Okay, so take your cape, maneuver it under the machine. It's a lot to work with at this point. And you're going to open out those two layers. And then you're understitching on the facing with the seam allowances underneath your stitching. And understitching from the hem up to the collar. Get as close as you can up to the collar, break your stitching. And then you're going to spend a long time pressing everything, right? You've got this center front edge to open. You've got the arm opening to press. Threads to trim, hems to repress. So just spend some time with your iron. This is where Andrea starts screaming at our iron because it did leak water on this beautiful pink cape. And you're going to do that same understitching on the other side of the center front. And then we'll move on to our belt. Okay, so we're ready to sew our belt. This is a very simple sash belt. So you'll have two long skinny rectangles. One is interfaced and the other is not. And we're going to pin them together all the way around, all of those edges. And you're going to leave one little 2 to 3 inch opening. And again, you can use that trick of X'd pins to remind yourself to stop stitching and leave that opening. You want to do that opening towards the center so that you're not having to turn this long, unwieldy rectangle from one side. You can do each side separately. And then after you're pinning, you're going to stitch all the way around, starting at one of your X'd pin marks. And of course, you're going to be pivoting at each corner and stitching at 5/8 of an inch. And then really all that's going to happen is we're going to grade down these seam allowances, trim our corners, of course, to remove any bulk, and then turn the belt right side out and top stitch it to kind of hold it nice and flat. And again, that top stitching is another nice opportunity for contrast stitching if you like. Really depends on the vibe you're going for in your cape, of course. If you want something more glam, evening wear inspired, or dressy, then I would say don't do contrast top stitching. But if you're looking for a daytime tailored look, it's a little bit more sporty or casual, then contrast top stitching is great. Okay, so you're going to grade your seam allowances. The uninterfaced one is the shorter one, or the narrower one. And then the interfaced one will be the wider one. And we'll move on to top stitching next. Okay, so now we are going to turn the belt right side out through the opening. So this is a process, of course. You can just do it by hand because it's a bit of a bigger tube here. Or if you have tools that you like to use, like a fast turn or something like that, you could use it here. Andrea is committed to doing it by hand, and it does take a little while, so we're gonna jump forward here in a minute. And then you're just going to poke out those corners and press the whole thing nice and flat. And just use your fingers to roll out the seam line so it's not sort of folded in on itself at the edges. And you'll have that opening that you'll just want to press flat with the seam allowances turned in. And now we're going to top stitch all the way around at 1/4 inch. And this will hold the layers of the belt nice and flat. You're going to pivot at each corner. And this will close that opening. If it bothers you that the seam allowance is open at the opening, then you can always do a little hand stitching there as well. But it will be held closed 1/4 inch in by the top stitching, of course. And then you're going to press this nice and flat, use some steam to get rid of any of those little wrinkles. And that is your lovely sash belt. And then we just have a little bit of finishing work to do. Okay, so now we've got a little finishing work to do on the inside of the facing. You will want to pin the buttonhole windows to the inside of the bound buttonholes, and then you're going to be slip stitching them all the way around. And you just want to sort of hide your stitching in between the 2 layers, so that you don't have visible stitching here, that you're kind of making it hidden between the layers of the buttonhole and the buttonhole window. And so you're going to do that hand stitching all the way around each buttonhole window. And then you can cut open the basting, the hand basting on your buttonhole, and it will be ready to be a buttonhole. Of course, you need buttons first, but you have a buttonhole now. And then you're going to sew your buttons on the opposite side, of course, and you have placement marks for those. You'll want to just align the two fronts and make sure that they match up, of course. And then you're going to hand sew your buttons in place. Finally, you are going to hem your outer cape. If you don't want your stitching to show, you'll want to do this by hand. It's going to take you a little while, but it's certainly worth it for that sort of seamless look at the bottom of your cape. So you're going to go all the way around, hand stitching that hem. And then the last thing to do is to create swing tacks between the outer cape and the lining. So at each seam, a couple inches above the hem, you're going to create a swing tack. And you may remember we learned this skill on the Las Vegas halter top because we had a little swing tack that went between the collar and the halter top to sort of help the collar stay in place but almost float on top of the halter top, which is one of my favorite features of that design. And in this case, you're using the same skill to just tack, but not too tightly, the outer cape to the lining. And it's called a swing tack so that the lining is still allowed to swing somewhat free and you don't see it sort of bunching up against the outer cape. So you might want to pin your cape to your ironing surface, and then you're going to anchor your stitching into the outer cape at the seam allowance only, and then you're going to be doing this little thread crochet move where you're almost like hand knitting. You're pulling the loop through itself to create this thread chain. And then once you've built up enough of a swing tack, it's up to you. Some people do really small ones, 1/2 inch. You might want more like 1 inch. Then you're going to thread your needle through the final loop there, pull it through, and then your swing tack is secure. You've got a little chain that you can then anchor into the lining at the same point above the hem. Some people do this with serger threads, like you can just chain off on your serger and then stitch that in place. Or thicker like silk buttonhole thread, you could use that, but then you usually have to do a buttonhole stitch over it, and that's a real pain. I've tried that once and I do not recommend it. So this thread crocheting, or hand crocheting method, I guess we can call it, of making a swing tack is actually fun once you get the hang of it, and it creates a really nice little swing tack. So you're gonna do that on each of your seams. So that the lining stays in place but still hangs freely. So at each seam, vertical seam around the cape, you're going to make a thread tack or a swing tack. And give it a final press, and your Drama Club cape is complete. All right, I hope you have loved learning to sew the Drama Club cape. We've gotten so many good tailoring skills in this month. And of course, it brings the Halloween drama. And if you're in our glamour tier or above, we do have a really fabulous Halloween extravaganza treat coming your way. That's an expansion on this pattern. So keep your eye out for that. So I hope you love this pattern so much. Happy Halloween. Goodbye.